he would task the CIA to immediately discover any possible other insurrections that could happen. As those orders were set, a second Dixie insurrection began, this time in Houston. It followed an identical pattern. Raid armory, raid the police, raid the main government building, block the exits, burn black and Jewish property. Goldwater immediately sent up 100,000 troops of the National Guard to stop the second insurrection. Quickly the outskirts of New Orleans were recaptured after the Dixie troops pushed out of the city. There the CIA managed to discover some disturbing information from a lieutenant they captured that another insurrection was set in Montgomery. Immediately after learning this fact, over 70,000 soldiers rallied around the streets of Montgomery, preventing the Dixiecrats from even starting the insurrection and showing up. On March 2, the National Guard managed to reach the Louisiana capital and demand the Dixiecrats to surrender. Of course, thinking they can still win, they do not surrender, and even start threatening to start killing the senators if the army were to enter the building. The army had no other option but had to enter the capital fast enough so that they wouldn't kill any senators, or at least to minimize the casualties. They encircled the entire building and entered at the same time from all sides, quickly turning the inside into a full-blown gunfight. They finally encircled the final insurgents and found 12 bodies of senators lying dead on the ground in the center of the Senate Hall. 10 Republican, 2 Democrats. The Houston Rebellion didn't manage to expand so much and was more swiftly taken care of, after surrounding them in the main governmental building of Houston, surrendered, ending the Dixie insurrections. This showed the dangers of the Dixie carts and were a force to be reckoned with, as there are still insurgents out there. For one, John Wagner went completely off the grid and was not found in the Louisiana capital, where he was allegedly seen by the soldiers that were present there. 12 days after the insurrection, in the outskirts of New Orleans, in a house that belonged to one of the generals William Becker that led the insurrections of New Orleans, found a bunch of documents. Amongst them there were plans for the insurrections, what to get out of this. Even some documents said that they were contacted by the SS and got aided by them in training and giving them weapons and money. Their propaganda campaigns, and even the plans of the assassination of John F. Kennedy. It is interesting that among the documents there were also plans to make one more insurrection in Atlanta that would happen 2 weeks after the Montgomery insurrection, and even a 5th insurrection in Richmond and a terrorist attack on Washington that the document said that it was cancelled due to insufficient manpower. Becker was immediately arrested and not only charged for terrorism but also conspiring an insurrection and an assassination. The same fate saw many other generals, lieutenants, and the soldiers that participated in the massacre. All of the participants insurgents would either get a life sentence or the more influential members would be given the death penalty. The CIA would set a bounty and be on a constant lookout for John Wagner, although some sources claimed that he first hid in the capital, after which he escaped from it unnoticed and fled the country, the Nazi Reich. This put Goldwater in the spotlight as a formidable option for re-election. This whole situation would severely anger the United States towards the Nazis and would be more willing to collaborate with the Italians and Japanese. Meanwhile, on February 12, 1966, the Holy Russian Empire is proclaimed by Sayajid Tabariki, unifying Russia under his regency. This completed Himmler's plan at unifying Russia under a Nazi puppet-like figure. Ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union, it felt inevitable for monarchism to return to Russia, but nobody expected it to come back like this. Many Nazi racial policies would be also implemented here. They exiled or killed any known Jews, Gypsies, and Poles. The small Polish community near the Urals, called now Polska, all its Polish citizens were exiled either east towards the Japanese Siberian territory or southwards towards Turkey and Persia. Tabariki's leadership would be seen as a form of dark age for the Russian people, but Tabariki still hoped that he would give up his leadership to Alexei. For the past year, the Nazis have been on an economic upward trajectory. The fertility rate rose to 4.1 child per woman. The life of Aryans and honorary Aryans improved. A new esoteric Nazi culture was established. In June of 1966, the Nazis officially landed on the moon, showing their superiority in rocketry. But the Nazis became very internationally isolated. They have lost all their allies: Italy, Japan, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and any other ally of theirs. Most lesser races were mostly eradicated, with the exception of the ones that were taken into slavery like blacks and Poles, although still many from these groups have been killed in concentration camps. The Nazis suffered from severe unrest in Reichskommissariat Moskowian and general government, as many slave revolts took place, resulting in worsening conditions for groups of Slavs. As these revolts transpire, many larger revolts would also take place, such as the Lublin Uprising, the Smolensk Uprising, and the Kursk Uprising. This would show the fallacies of the Nazi system, and although the Nazis were successful at containing these uprisings, it came at great costs. Sayajid Tabariki's condition starts to deteriorate. The clock is ticking on his leadership. It seems like the empire may implode and collapse as there isn't a prominent successor. But out of what seems to be nowhere, a man comes to turn to the capital of the Holy Russian Empire. The man claims to be Alexei. Sayajid's prophecy finally came to be true. During the night that the Bolsheviks attacked the royal family of Russia, Alexei with his aunt escaped out of the building and stayed in Chita. Later, once the Japanese occupied Chita, he decided to stay there and be under the radar. Eventually her aunt's state would worsen until she died not a long time ago. After this, he decided to finally return to his homeland, as there was nothing else he could have lost, even if he were to be assumed as not to be Alexei. But the regent believed him. They compared his fingerprints from objects from the palace that were stored in a warehouse in Perm, and it was a perfect match. Immediately Tabariki would organize his coronation. It was a large ceremony. Himmler was slightly worried with these events. He thought that maybe with Alexei back he might seek to revolt against the Nazis. At the beginning, Alexei would show cooperation. As the new king, he would de-radicalize some extremist policies imposed by Tabariki. The regent completely subordinated himself under the Tsar. This began a time for Russia where they would start slowly distancing themselves from Himmler. In 1968, Goldwater would win re-election, continuing the status quo. But a new party has been founded that started to gain prominence, the Libertarian Party. It became very popular in states like California, the New England region, Nevada, and Colorado. They would found their party in December of 1971, in response to the decision to go of the gold standard and the start of instituting price controls and other socialist monetary policies presented by President Goldwater and his Vice President Richard Nixon. Thanks to the works and input of effort from the side of people like Ayn Rand and Rothbard, and the legacy of the spiritual mobilization that started to resurface again after being prominent for 10 years after dropping out of popularity over the 1960s and returning with the rise of the Libertarian Party. In the 1972 election, they would win the state of Nevada, Maine, Colorado, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire, taking away votes from both groups. They would still lose the election to newly elected President Nixon. Nixon's presidency would end up being very unpopular as inflation rises, regulation rises, and the economy stagnates. This would further boost the popularity of the libertarian movement. A new figure would rise to prominence in the Nazi Reich. Hans Wagner, born a Nazi family in Prague on April 20, 1945. He lived in a middle-class family connected in via an uncle to the Wehrmacht. His uncle was a fairly influential member of the Wehrmacht. After serving in the Second Great War, he became a commander, and 10 years before retiring became a general. Hans was fascinated with his uncle and wanted to also be an influential figure. An important event in his life would happen in 1953 when he visited the US with his uncle and the foreign minister Ribbentrop while Ribbentrop was on a diplomatic mission to calm the relations between the US and the Nazis. He saw how Americans lived, even split for a moment and almost getting lost in Washington. For the short time he was there, this gave him a very unique perspective and started to have a small grudge against the tyrannical regime of Hitler back home. He decided to keep this for himself, even hiding his disdain from his uncle. No, he has become one of Himmler's key advisors. He even became the financial minister of the Greater Nazi Reich, and tried to liberalize some parts of the economy. This would end up being very profitable for the Nazis, making them much more economically stronger, boosting entrepreneurism significantly. Who knows what are his ambitions onwards as his influence grows? As the months go by, in the United States, Nixon's presidency would take a dark turn. It was discovered that Nixon is connected to the recent Watergate scandal that involved wiretapping and sabotaging the Democrats. Nixon would try to cover it up as much as possible, but the truth inevitably came out. This resulted in Nixon's resignation from his position and leaving the presidential cabinet to his vice president Gerald Ford. Gerald's presidency was very lackluster and had a big problem of stagflation, a mix of high inflation and increase in unemployment. This would further worsen the position of the Republican Party. Now not only was the Democratic Party distrusted by the public, but now the Republicans too. This resulted in many very progressive Democrats moving away from the racist image of the Democratic Party and founding their own new progressive party. The Libertarians had a massive spike in popularity as people saw that socialist-like policies were simply not working for them. Leading to the election of 1976, we had for the Libertarians John Hosper, for the Republicans we had Gerald Ford trying to reclaim his image and trust, as the Democratic nominee it was Jimmy Carter, and for the Progressives it was Ted Kennedy. This election would end with nobody winning a straight-up majority, as the vote was very split between the different factions, where the Progressives had 94 votes, the Republicans had 137 votes, the Democrats 134, and finally the Libertarians with 173 votes. The Libertarians were finally chosen as they had the most electoral votes of them all and having the most senators in the House of Representatives, meaning that John Hosper would become the next president of the United States. Hosper's presidency would focus on deregulation and lowering taxes. He would abolish 70% of still existing welfare programs, lower taxes to a low percentage of 4%. He also cut temporarily funding from the CIA and the military in favor of maintaining a balanced budget. He also pushed other members of the International Republic to spend more if they want more protection, as the US cannot alone try to hold all military might. The inflation generated by the Nixon administration was reversed within a year, and his policies stimulated serious economic growth. Entrepreneurism was on the rise, and the population started growing more rapidly. He did see much opposition when it came to implementing some policies, as he only was president but didn't have majority in neither the House of Representatives nor the Senate. In Russia, the Tsar continues to grow in his power and distance his empire away from the Nazis. He funds many heavy military industrial projects, ramping up military spending very fast. This further increased after a sudden meeting with Wagner. Unknowingly to Himmler, Hans was negotiating an invasion of the Nazi Reich, which was a part of a greater plan of his unknown to anyone at this point except Hans himself. But more would yet come. On June 22, 1981, on the 40th anniversary of Operation Barbarossa, the crusade against Bolshevism, Alexei launched Operation Reverse Barbarossa, the invasion of the eastern territories of the Nazi Reich. After careful preparation and staying under the radar of Himmler, disguising it under an invasion of Japan's eastern territories. Due to Himmler's ignorance, the Holy Russian Empire made swiftly great advances into the Reichskommissariats.